Hello, Wake Up New Zealand, Kara Seeker speaking. Means I went on this co-governance march today. I'd like to go over a bit of history about co-governance that many people might not know about. So where did that come from? Well, Andrew Paul, he was the president of the Indian-Canadian Brotherhood. Now, he first started using this word Indigenous for the native people in Canada. So he passed away, and a friend of his, who was also in the Brotherhood by the name of George Manuel, became the president of that Brotherhood. Later, George Manuel established the Indigenous World Council. The first time that the Indigenous World Council went to the UN and George Manuel spoke, as he was the president of the council, to the Hall of Assembly of the UN, there were other natives there. And 100 of them got up and walked out in protest when George Manuel started to speak. They walked out in protest because they'd never heard of this being called Indigenous. This was new to them. And the other thing was, George Manuel, the Indigenous World Council, did not ask them for consent to be called Indigenous. So that's why they walked out. Moving on. 1971, George Manuel, with the Canadian delegation, came to New Zealand, and they were shown from one Maori entertainment event to another, and yes, they did the tourist thing and ran different events that Maori hold, like hakas and what have you. That's what you do when you're a tourist coming to New Zealand, and they did just that. And then before George Manuel left New Zealand to go on to Australia to speak to the Aboriginals there, as he did here. So before he left, he invited a number of Maori politicians and certain Maori entertainers to his hotel room, where he seriously talked to them about being called Indigenous, to take on this Indigenous, which has been postmodernized because it's actually a Latin word, which means to beget, to be born in, etc., etc., etc. You can look that up. So anyhow, this is how it started. So moving on from there, 1997 to 2007, a number of Iwi Maori started working with the UN to implement, as they planned, the UNDRIP, United Nations Declaration for Indigenous Peoples' Rights. Now, that is co-governance in New Zealand. And if you go on the net and you look at what's being said, you will surely see it's very well matched up. They've got UNDRIP, co-governance New Zealand. So Rosemary Banks was the representative for New Zealand in 2007 when they first adopted this UN declaration at the UN Assembly. So she spoke out on behalf of New Zealand's government, which was Labour-led at the time, rejecting the UNDRIP, as did Australia, America, and Canada. So why did she reject it? Well, firstly, it was not compliant with the constitutional and legal arrangements for New Zealand, nor was it compliant with the Te Tiriti or Waitangi. and it gave Indigenous people the right that others did not have. And it also proposed two classes of citizens in New Zealand, the whole Marxist thing. So it sought redress, compensation for the entire land in New Zealand. The redress referred to compensation, redress, control of land territories that the Indigenous people owned, occupied, or used. This potentially is the entire country of New Zealand, which includes lands that are legally owned by others. This is the reason this was rejected. And on top of that, this gave Indigenous people the right to veto over New Zealand's natural resources. So my take on this is we should go back. We should never have let this happen. I don't know how we would have stopped it, but Te Tiriti o Waitangi did not create partnerships, and it did not create principles. They were legislated in Parliament. That was not part of the original Maori Treaty. I believe in democratic rights for all people, that there should be a one law for all people, no race-based politics. I just do not believe in race-based politics. I feel that one nation for all people, a law for all people, and for a stable, cohesive society with a sense of national unity, proud to be New Zealanders. Be proud of our farmers. They have kept us afloat. We relied on our farmers to keep our country alive and profiting and well looked after. And what's happening? The government is using the farmers as their whipping boy. So New Zealand's natural resources, they shouldn't be controlled or owned by one race over another. They should benefit all New Zealanders. I mean, Crown Enterprises, there is a lot of land stuff, land infrastructure and that is actually belongs to all New Zealanders. A lot of people do not realise this. So that's why I marched today. I oppose co-governance. I oppose He Puapua. I oppose the UNDRIP. I oppose Vision 2040. I oppose apartheid. And I think of it like this, on a personal basis. I have two lots of blood that belongs to two different ethnic groups or cultures, whatever you want to call it, because we've all got a culture. So my father being Irish, my mother being English. Now, many moons ago, the Irish girls and women were taken as slaves by the English to the Americas. They were sold there. And those black African slaves were actually the masters of those Irish girls. They had to do what they were told by the black African slaves. This was called indentation. So, you have to know the language. Slavery, it was called indentation. So those young Irish women, girls, they were made to have babies to these black African slaves, and those children born from those black African slaves and the Irish girls was sold for a much higher price. And this is what happened. So think about this. So half of me is English, half of me is Irish. My English side enslaved my Irish side. So what am I going to do? Am I going to have a big fight inside of me? For goodness sake, people. This is institutionalized racism to divide a country. So dividing a country, you make a nation weak. You make a population weak who cannot stand up for their rights against this government. So what we all thought that the police were there to look after us. No, they're there to serve those parliamentarians. That's what they're there for. And I was quite blown away when I read that a World Economic Forum assessment was made of police right across the world. So there I see New Zealand police. So they looked at the assessment from 1 low to 7 high for 3 years in a row. This is the World Economic Forum. New Zealand police was 6.2 out of 7, 6.4 out of 7, and 6.4 out of 7. Why are they assessing our police? We need to actually stand up and be counted. I know it's very uncomfortable when you first stand up and try and speak out in public. You can be nervous. But I tell you what, the more you do it, it is much easier. And it gives you strength. When you've had your power taken from you, you become self-empowered. So I encourage you to speak up. So it was great to see Julian Batchelor and Brian Tamaki there in Aotearoa Square today, talking together. It was a great example. I will be going to Wellington next week. I absolutely oppose UN Agenda 2030. I think of the IA 2030, that is the decade of vaccines that was introduced actually right back in 2011, and then they reintroduced, they amended it again in 2019, and it's leave no one behind, everyone, everywhere, at every age. So when people talk about UN Agenda 2030, it's about 2007, the whole economies were going into recession, corporations were going down, there was only a few that were surviving, and Klaus Schwab, WEF, he had a meeting, and there were corporations, governments, academics, philanthropists, and he said to them, "What would you like to see happen in the future?" And guess what? It was this, what we see now. This was Klaus Schwab's Global Redesign Initiative of 2008, 604 pages long. It is the fourth industrial revolution that you see in his 604-page long Global Redesign. It is Agenda 2030. It is Agenda 21. It is everything you see happening now. It is stakeholder capitalism. It is corporate capture. Now, when the UN introduced Agenda 2030 to the world in 2015, by 2019, they were saying, "Oh my gosh, we don't have enough political clout to actually make this happen. We don't have enough money." And the WEF had already been working with them for years. So it was decided that the WEF, World Economic Forum, and the UN would sign a memorandum, a partnership memorandum. It was official. That's what they did, because the WEF had the clout and the money that the UN needed to accelerate UN Agenda 2030. And your UN Agenda 2030 is these jabs that's happening now and has been happening the last few years. It is the 15-minute cities, it's the surveillance, it's the censorship, it's the shutting you down to silence. Silence means consent. It's all of that. It's political policing. They don't want you speaking up. Already Auckland is a C40 city. It has a plant-based diet that they want to implement, where local bodies, local councils, they will be the ones who will implement mass migration. So local governments will be implementing mass migration. This is all part of it. Already, we have migration officers who have gone and got jobs elsewhere in New Zealand because their senior officers are telling them, when you get migrants come through, ignore that they've got criminal histories, ignore any other paperwork, just get them through, and those migration officers who can get as many through as possible will get a shout out. That is absolutely true. So to me, that poses a serious security risk to our country. And that is more reason why we should come together as a one nation to protect New Zealand. We should never be a divided nation. There is strength in unity. Wake up, New Zealand.